Sorry about that. We'll start off on our second question, I guess. So, what does it mean for a city to domesticate nature? That was part of our title, and there are many different versions of domestication. So, we would like to know, Paige, what domestication in the city means to you.
Right. So I use that word partly to be provocative, to sort of get people to think more about not just what is there, what kind of nature is there, but how we interact with it. So if you think about what sort of plants are in this picture and sort of animals you might find there, probably the first things that come to mind are some things that are very, very broadly distributed and are not particularly rare in the place that you live. And so one aspect of domestication is just this potential simplification or sort of, let me get to actually show you, I'm just gonna skip over to this picture right here. So if you look here at this image, think for yourselves for a minute, like where in the world is this? And usually when I ask this question, people scratch their heads for a while and then and come up with about a lot of guesses, and any of those guesses could be right. Where it actually is, let's see if it actually reveals. Yes, this is a National Geographic photo of an area in China. So, but it could be anywhere. We look at it and we realize that that this form of urbanization is this structure of having single family homes with streets and yards is a form that's replicated over and over and place to place. And so that kind of homogenization, the sameness everywhere, that kind of sameness is one aspect of domestication, as we sort of take what was there and then reshape it to suit our needs in ways that are that are very consistent from place to place. And a consequence of that is that there are some species, for example, this pigeon and this grass, the Poa annua, that are found in nearly every city of the world that we've looked at. So there is some also sameness in terms of which species. So these are the species that get along well with us. So that's one aspect of domestication. But there's other aspects that we'll get into, I think, more in a minute, but have to do with how we interact and how we're sort of changing potentially the behavior of the species around us.
That's fascinating. Yeah, looking at that picture, I mean, it could be anywhere in Massachusetts, even.
Yeah.
So,
One thing I'd, if maybe follow up on that with, is though the sort of a kind of paradox, a kind of juxtaposition of, so while cities have the sameness, and there's so many places that you can plunk yourself down and not be sure which part of the world you're in if you're in a city, at the same time within cities there's a whole lot of variability. So cities are also very patchy. There's lots of different kinds of natures within cities. And so if this top row of pictures is all from the city of Baltimore, Maryland, a place that I've done work for many years. And these are all lots of different little bits of green spaces. And depending on sort of how they got there and to what extent people are actively managing them, they can be very, very different in terms of the kinds of plants and therefore the kinds of animals that are in them. And the bottom row are all different yards in the city of Phoenix, Arizona, another place that I've worked a lot. And you can see that you can have one yard that is almost, looks almost like a desert, like the surrounding area of Phoenix. And on the far right is a place that has trees that are from alpine places and places in the Middle East. And so just the vegetation is completely different from yard to yard. So that you have this amazing variability at the same time that we have this. So it's this kind of perplexing, cities are full of paradoxes like this.
yeah, I remember first time I visited Phoenix, I was kind of blown away by how much green there was with, like, especially flying into the Phoenix airport, seeing this vast desert and then like this big green golf course.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that is one aspect of domestication, as we reshape the environment to suit our needs. And frequently, no matter what environment we're in, that suiting our needs involves lawns and trees and water, even if we're in a desert.
Yeah, and so that brings me to a lot of people are thinking about what species they see in the city, whether they're bird watching, looking outside of their window, or they're taking a walk in a park. And which cities are really benefiting, or sorry, which species are really benefiting from cities, and are there ways that cities negatively affect biodiversity?
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe back up just to be able to show you, as we think about these sort of contrasting, so I showed you the first picture of the little pocket park, which is actually in Boston, this other picture, which is also in Boston. So you have a place that you could stand around in and not have any idea you're in a city, and yet it's so it looks just like a forest. But so even in that place that looks just like any other forest, the surrounding city environment does affect which species that you get there. And so for we can get a much more wide array of species than we might have previously thought. So we did a study of birds around the world and from cities around the world, and 1 out of 5 species of birds in the world has been detected in some city somewhere. So there's more diversity there than we might initially think. But there certainly are winners and losers, as some people like to call them. So there are species that, and I think I need to sort of skip quite a bit ahead to show you a couple of the winners and losers here from Massachusetts area. So as you get more urban, so this is a timeline of birds and what that were observed in just one tiny part of Cambridge, Massachusetts, over decades. And so the things at the top are things that were more present at the start of that time period, and the things at the bottom are things that were more present in the later time period. So, and over that time period, Cambridge got more and more dense, more and more densely built. So this gives you kind of an example picture as the things at the top are things that tend to lose, the species of birds you tend to lose as the city gets more densely built. And the species at the bottom are things that are pretty robust to urbanization, especially in places that still have some lawn and trees and shrubs and things like that. So the eastern wood pewee, for example, the top bird species, is very much a forest bird, and so they sort of dropped out pretty early on. The wood thrush is one below, is another forest bird, has a lovely song. Even though it's a forest bird, you see that it stayed right up until some of the later decades was present, even though it wasn't necessarily breeding. But then at the bottom, we have things like the gray catbird and the cardinal, which I think probably anyone who has a bird feeder has probably seen a cardinal around. And catbirds are the ones that you'll hear you going mew mew in in the bushes around your house. So both of those things have. The interesting thing, though, of course, is that the cardinal didn't used to be here. You see, it showed up later, not so much because it likes urban more than not urban, but that it moved northward. It expanded its range with climate change. So there's a bunch of intersecting factors that affect the winners and the losers, but these are some examples.
Those are great examples, yeah. And I guess it depends on what you saying when you mean city too, because I know that I've heard peewees and house wrens and those sorts of things in the suburbs, even sort of the more densely populated suburbs out here in Western Mass.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so these are not sort of cut and dry things. And one thing we talk about is urbanization as a gradient, and that and there are many different sizes of things that we call cities, and we call some things towns. So depending on we know there's not really a sort of urban not urban cutoff. But we talk about things more in terms of like a spectrum, a sort of rainbow of more or less densely built up areas that are more or less urban.
Yeah. So I guess that's a great place to pause for a second. And I'd like to remind the audience that the Q&A button is below down toward the center, and you could type in whatever question you have about what we're talking about, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can. So let's see. It always takes a couple seconds for people to figure out exactly what they'd like to ask. So we'll give them a little bit of time.
If you want to, I can also show another example from one of my other favorite stomping grounds of Phoenix, of a different set of winners and losers for
Sure.
for birds. So this is a set of studies that we did over the counts of birds in riparian areas, basically areas that are along streams or wet areas, which there are streams and wet areas even in the sort of natural desert around Phoenix. And so we looked at some that were natural areas and some that were more human created wetlands. And we counted birds over about a dozen years. And so the circles are basically sort of the sort of center point of a whole, you know, every point is a site, and the space between sites is how different the birds are at those sites. And so the circle is kind of like, you know, the on average, what does the bird community look like at this site, at all of these sites over time? So that arrow is time, is sort of indicating time. So at the bottom, you know, things back in time at the start of the study, we had a lot of migratory birds like this yellow warbler here. But as over time, even within places that were quite natural in terms of their structure, the surrounding urbanization was leading to a sort of drying and sort of shift from wet area birds to upland birds and urban birds like the house sparrow and the mourning dove. So we have the same sort of pattern of winners and losers, especially migratory birds compared to resident birds, for example. So it looks like there might be questions.
Yes, we do. We have a couple. I'll read a few to you. So we have a birding question, and it's difference twixt song sparrow and common sparrow in appearance. I think by common sparrow, they mean house sparrow, probably.
All right, so this is we have on the screen here a house sparrow. The song sparrow is going to be a little bigger and a little more streaky, and the big thing for me with the song sparrow is the big spot in the middle of the chest. So if you can ever get a look head on and see that spot in the chest, then you've got a song sparrow.
Great. I knew we'd get some birding questions, and we probably will continue. So another question is, do you find that species that do well in naturally disturbed areas also do well in urban areas? And I guess a follow-up would be, what is a naturally disturbed area?
Right, and so I think that's a great question. It's one that we're actually still grappling with in urban ecology. So to what extent is, you know, urbanization an area with high disturbance? And so there certainly are areas within cities that have a lot of disturbance. So you think about roadside edges, or even lawns are places that are mowed, and so mowing is a kind of disturbance. So there are many species, for example, of plants that seem to do really well in our lawns and those little weedy patches alongside roads and old vacant lots and things like that. So I think there is some association with sort of species that do well with disturbance. But one other thing I want to sort of push people to think about just how stable some parts of cities can be. So while we mow frequently, the end effect is that we try to keep our yards the same. We try to keep our parks the same. We try to keep things, people resist change. So there's also a sort of buffering of variability that happens. So disturbance and urbanization are not the same thing. There are disturbances in urban areas, but urbanization itself, while there's an initial disturbance of converting a forest, let's say, to housing development, after that, there's a great deal of stability. And so some of those species that come there, they just happen to like the features that are there. They're not necessarily associated with disturbance. I hope that I said that clearly enough.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, when I'm doing my habitat surveys in backyards, I only really need to do them for maybe 1 year out of the 3, because they don't really change all that much.
Right.
Maybe someone adds a tree here or there, or a plant, or a vegetable garden, but for the most part, it's a lawn and then, you know, some other features.
Yep. And we've been able to document that in Phoenix with some very stark things, like the way that people have sort of xeric yards, like pea gravel and drought tolerant vegetation and things like that. And other yards have turf grass and shade trees, and they use a lot of water to maintain those things. And those things have been very stable over the decade and a half or so that we've been studying Phoenix. Even with new ownership for homes, there's a lot of inertia. Think how hard it is to completely redo a yard. Those of you who've been out gardening as part of COVID times.
Oh yeah, especially from like grass, ripping all the grass out and putting down gravel and succulents. That must be really difficult. So we have one more question, and then we'll move on. So, are there programs or resources which encourage cities to support urban wildlife?
Yeah, there's several different ones. So probably the one that many people have heard about is the National Wildlife Federation, sort of backyard wildlife certification. I'm probably botching the name, but they've been in play for probably a couple of decades at least. So those are maybe geared towards individual landowners, individual homeowners. There's also some sustainable sites initiatives and even some work towards getting LEED certification. So LEED certification is that certification about green building and sustainable building practices. And so there's movement towards trying to also certify the surrounding of areas of buildings. There's folks in the Netherlands that have done some amazing tools for builders. Like here, if you want to have buildings that are safe, let's say from bird strikes on windows, and are going to attract, landscaping that's going to attract these kinds of birds. Here's a key, here's a key of how to do your construction. So there's a number of tools out there. Yard Map from Cornell University is a tool from the folks that do eBird, and so Cornell's Lab of Ornithology has a lot of great tools, and Yard Map is one for you to figure out how to design your own yard to support biodiversity.
Great. Looks like we have another question, but it actually ties well into the second vignette. So I will hold on that one and get to that in a bit. Our next category is we're diving in a little bit into the nitty gritty and talking about how cities reshape behavior, interactions, and even evolution. I don't know how many people who have been to our evolution talks are really thinking about evolution happening in our cities, but it's pretty amazing. So my first question is, are there ways that cities are reshaping species?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's increasing focused on this. This has become sort of an emerging new area of science, is basically sort of urban evolutionary ecology. One of the big factors that I've focused on in thinking about how we reshape, so maybe not so much directly how we reshape the shapes of animals, like how they look or their body parts, but how they interact with the world around them, is through the huge influence that we have, the huge amount of human food, sort of human provided food and other resources. So food, water, fertilizer, think about all of the things that we put out in the world around us. So I've got here a picture of people feeding birds in the park, which is a favorite kid pastime. Actually, one of my kids is in this picture, and so the amount of food that's sometimes intentionally put out like this, or maybe unintentionally put out as well. Well, this is definitely intentional, but it's cute. So my parents have one of these things. It doesn't look quite like that, but so think about the food that's available on plants, the food that's available from think about this park and how there's garbage cans, and some of them may be closed, but many of them are open. And there's a fascinating study of ants in New York City that looked at the work that ants do to clean up cities. And they actually did an experiment putting out junk food in little street medians, basically to mimic all of the junk food wrappers and bits of French fries and things like that we drop, when we're just eating in the park. And the ants are doing an amazing job of actually sort of cleaning up that food waste, which means that we're actually subsidizing those ant communities. So there's a lot of influence from food and water resources that then have effects on lots of different things. So I'll just, we'll get to evolution in a minute, but let me just talk a little bit more about the sort of interactions between species and between species and us. So going back to this, the squirrel here, squirrels are cute and fun to watch. Sometimes they drive us crazy when they get in our bird feeders. And the other effect they have on birds is that they are pretty voracious predators of nests, nestlings and eggs. And so one of the studies we've done, and it connects with studies a lot of other folks have done, is comparing the densities of predators in to sort of starkly put it, suburban areas and rural areas. So we've got areas around Amherst and areas out in the Quabbin Reservoir. And you can see here that across several years of counting predators, and a big chunk of these are squirrels, we have twice as many predators in the suburban, the green bars, as in the blue bars, the rural areas. But so you'd think, what would you think that would do? Like, what would you think that would do if these squirrels and other nest predators are more abundant, in part, we think, because of the human food resources that we provide? What's going to happen to nesting songbirds? So one of the weird things is that, so you probably are thinking, oh boy, those poor nesting songbirds are just had it. They're going to get hammered. And while some do, there's a lot of studies, and ours was looking at wood thrush in particular, where, looking at sort of one measure of nest success here is daily nest survival. So basically the higher that bar is, the better off the birds are doing in terms of producing young from their nests. And you see the blue bars and the green bars are not different from each other here. There's no statistical difference across multiple years. Nesting success of wood thrush that are in forest fragments around Amherst and out in big tracts of forest where there's fewer predators. So we have this thing we call some people call it the predation paradox, this sort of decoupling of predation risk from predator densities, from the amount of predators. And one of the factors that people have proposed is that basically human food is sort of changing the diets of some of these predators and decoupling the interaction between predators and prey.
Yeah, I can imagine it would be a lot easier to pick up a French fry off the ground than it would be, or birdseed than it would be to try to hunt and find a really hidden nest and be hammered by a bird trying to defend it.
Right. Yeah, and when we look across species, so there's this studies that have been done on lots of different kinds of species and their use of human food. There are quite a few mammal species that use human food, but they also vary in the extent to which they become sort of focused on it and narrow their diet to focus on that and not have effects on other food sources. So, for example, raccoons. There's this great study from Chicago that Stan Garrett did of this whole raccoon population that basically they eat out of the garbage cans in this park all through the summer. They make hay when the sun shines, and when winter comes around and the garbage cans are empty, they just starve themselves through the winter. And but there's enough food, and they build up enough fat that enough raccoons make it through the winter, and they come out the other side and they still go back to eating out of the garbage cans. On the other hand, things like coyotes that have been studied have a great deal of very individual variability. So there are some coyotes that will focus in on human food, and other individual coyotes that are still eating natural food sources, eating wild things. And what that often means is, so that doesn't mean that they're not being influenced or influencing this whole sort of human influenced web. Because if we think about it, all of that increase in the abundance of things like rabbits in the lawn or squirrels or Canada geese, which coyotes apparently really love to eat, is influencing the diet of those coyotes as well. So we're having a big influence even on creatures that are not directly eating our human food.
I did not know that about coyotes and Canada geese, but we sure do love attracting them to our man-made ponds and all those other sorts of things, and bread and
Yeah.
so yeah.
Go
So
ahead.
I think let's dive in. We have a little bit more time left in this vignette, so let's dive in a little bit to evolutionary change and
Yeah.
I know that, like you said, it's kind of a newish field of urban ecology, how cities have led to evolutionary change.
Yeah, I couldn't resist. Throw this in here before I really get into evolution. These are some more behavioral changes. So house finches have become kind of one of the big cool stories of urban ecology and urban behavioral ecology. So the nest on the right is a very fanciful image, but it's illustrating that there's a wonderful study from Mexico City of house finches taking cigarette butts and weaving them into their nest. And at first you might think, well, that's just sort of opportunistic use of, and what they showed was that they're actually attracted to the tobacco, and that the tobacco is probably protecting the nest from parasites, giving some sort of chemical protection from parasites. So this is a neat behavioral change that has taken advantage of sort of human waste, but is a behavior they already had of seeking out sort of plant material that has chemical properties, but they they were flexible enough to discover that cigarette butts had some of those same properties. So those are house finches on the left. So when you said evolution, so one of the first and kind of best documented and studies about that showed a change, an evolutionary change. So meaning like, you know, changes in genes in a population over time, that was in this case related to something that you could see with your eyes, was this little dandelion-like plant called Crepus sancta. It's its scientific name. The scientists that did this study were in the south of France, for sorry souls that had to do their urban ecology research in the south of France. And they were looking at these two different seed types here. You've got one that is that flies just like your dandelion, typical, like we think of dandelion seeds flying, and one that just drops to the ground. So out in the vineyards surrounding Montpellier, the plants out there have a lot of flying seeds. So any individual plant can have both of these seeds, but they tend to have a higher proportion of those flying seeds when you're out in the vineyards. When you're growing up in a sidewalk like this, think what happens if your seeds fly. A lot of your seeds land on pavement. So there's been strong selection. Basically, plants with a lot of flying seeds tend to not produce as many viable offspring that find a place to grow up. So they've actually evolved over time, very rapidly, to have fewer proportionally flying seeds and more dropping seeds in this population.
Wow, that's an incredible example, and also an example of how to pick a great study site.
Right. I'm not always as good as they are at that.
Did you have any other examples of evolutionary change to share?
Sure. The project that I've been involved with involved some colleagues so Lynn Adler and Becky Irwin, who've been studying this interaction between bees and so native bees and a native plant. This is they've studied it in many different parts of the Southeast. So it's a native vine that grows up in the trees, especially in the sort of pine forests of North Carolina and South Carolina, Georgia, called yellow jasmine or gelsemium. It has a little bit of a look of honeysuckle, but you don't want to suck on this plant because it has nasty toxic chemicals in its nectar. And there's actually stories of honey being poisoned by it and things like that. But it's a beautiful native vine. And it attracts pollinators that pollinate it. And it lives both out in the sort of woodlands, and here there's basically, it's hard, I've got the blue flag to indicate that there's a vine creeping up this small pine that, as you can see, is just on the outskirts of this McMansion lawn in the Raleigh area. So what Becky and Lynn had been discovering was that whenever they looked at these plants near houses, they were finding a sort of interesting change in the bees in sort of interactions with bees. So bees pollinate this plant, but one of the bees that visits this plant is a carpenter bee. And carpenter bees make holes in things. You may have seen carpenter bees making holes in your own house or in our playground equipment behind the house. And they make these slits in the side of the flower and suck out the nectar without pollinating it. So they cheat. So from the plant's point of view, this is not good. They take the nectar and they haven't been pollinated, so the plant is not making seeds. There's other bugs that interact with this. So there's a moth larva that when the moth lays its eggs, the larva chews up the flower, and then the flower, if it gets too chewed up, is not going to make seeds. So the plant is kind of it has these two competing needs. It needs to attract pollinators, and it needs to repel these antagonists, the what we call the nectar robbers and the florivores. And so what they were interested in was whether maybe a shift in having more carpenter bees around, things that are going to be antagonists, things that are going to steal the nectar, was going to change basically how toxic these plants were. Would they be more toxic when they're trying to repel more of these, and when they didn't have to worry about pollination quite so much? It didn't turn out to be quite as simple as that, but there were a couple of things that we found when we looked at these places. So the shape, turns out that florivores were more attracted to flowers that had narrow openings, these sort of narrow corollas, or sort of narrow tube, and wider tubes got less florivory. So they were able to document, as we worked together, Becky and Lynn did these cool experiments to show that that plants with a lot of florivory were being selected to have these wider flowers, and sort of in association with that, we were able to show that the forest flowers outside of cities were more likely to have these narrow tubes, and the flowers in the city have these wider tubes. So again, this is like one step short of being able to show quite as neatly as the folks in France did, that this is like, we don't know over time whether this has evolved over time, but it sure looks like it. So we have something that is like a shape change in the plant that is because we've altered the way the plant is interacting with the bugs that come to it.
Wow, and I can imagine over time that could even lead to different subspecies or even species of things in the urban.
And so one of the key, yeah, and that's a question people have been asking. We haven't really got any great examples yet, because one of the things is that for them to turn into different species, there has to be some limit to the gene flow from the interbreeding between populations in and out of the suburban areas, and these are very long-lived plants, so it would be quite hard to detect that right off. One of the things, the way of thinking about it is that this is kind of a spillover effect. So look at this yard here, full of these azaleas. So this is the season when yellow jasmine or gelsemium is blooming. And back in the woods there, it's that early spring where there's barely any leaves on the trees, and there's not much blooming in the forest at that time of year. So these gardens are full of food resources for those bees. And we did transects where we sort of walked along the street and we walked through the forest and we counted how many flowers. This was one of the part I did, was the counting of the flowers. Let me tell you, that was the tricky part. So there was twice as many flowers in these sort of suburban areas in the forest areas. So this big resources being put in that are supporting those bees, and we do see higher bee abundances in those areas. But then that is sort of changing this interaction where there's also more of those critters that chew on the flowers and suck the nectar out.
Yeah, so I guess things are really evolving in the city. That's really interesting. I think we'll go into some questions now. We do have one clarifying question. What is florivory versus folivory?
Oh, good. Yeah. So the florivory means like flora is the flower. So it eats the flower, whereas folivory eats the leaves, like the foliage. Great question. Yeah. And so you can see how chewed up this flower is, but the leaves are super toxic in this plant. They just really don't get chewed on. Even deer really don't eat them. So.
And another question has to do with, I guess, behavior and noise. So some medians and highway edges are really big and are protected from people by fences and the highway itself. These habitats are isolated in certain ways, but are affected by noise and pollution from traffic. Could studies of these habitats help in figuring out what aspect of urbanization affects the species?
Oh, that's a cool idea. Yeah, sounds like a great study for somebody to do. I could lob this one back at you, Aaron. So Aaron did his master's degree looking at some noise effects on cardinals in Florida. So noise is absolutely something, and there's been some really clever studies that have not using that interesting idea of these sort of protected next to highway. One other thing about highways is like if it's next to a highway, you also have like runoff and you have disturbance from the vehicles. So one of the cool studies somebody did was out in New Mexico where there's these I think it's natural gas wells that make this booming sound as they sort of are pumping. So this like regular loud booming sound. So there's this like a tiny little dirt road and a gas well and then this booming sound, and people are not there most of the time. Cars are not there most of the time. It's just like, so throughout that kind of mountainous, rugged forest area around it, that's basically the biggest human input is just the noise. So they've been able to show that there's some really interesting effects on the behavior of the animals around there. Some animals being actually avoiding the noise and other animals coming in, and that affected actually, I'm going to forget the details right now, but affected actually pollination and seed consumption, and so there's some neat ways that people have tried to tease apart these different effects of urbanization.
It's absolutely amazing. Yeah. And I have read a few studies that have looked at medians and highway edges as like almost micro green spaces. Like they're
Yeah,
very skinny, but they're really long. And
yeah,
DOT has a lot of control over them. So a lot of them you see like the don't mow, there's wildflowers right here sort of
yeah.
signs by the highway.
Yeah, and there's some people who've studied how those become then corridors and pathways for range expansion and movement of animals as well.
Another question I get all the time that goes back to how cities reshape behavior and the food resources is bird feeding, putting out seed for birds beneficial? Should I be doing that?
Wow, that's such a great question. Yeah, I was on a panel at a conference where I was sitting between two people, one of whom had written a book called Nature Wars that was advocated that we should never ever feed any animals, and another guy on the other side of me who had written John Marsland, who wrote the book Suburbia, who was arguing that like any connection people can form with nature is good because it fosters our interest in protecting nature. So even feeding, pigeons in the park is a beneficial thing for people to do, because so we have these two people who are experts who were diametrically opposed, and I always kind of strike down right in the middle, and I think it's worth thinking about, like, what is it you're trying to achieve, and what do you care about, and if we can think about what are the sort of ramifications of feeding, sometimes it may not have that big of an effect, especially if we're feeding, let's say, a variety of different foods, so that we're not just supporting those common broadly distributed species. If all we do is put out, seed mixtures that house sparrows and cowbirds and things like that pigeons will come eat, or doves will come eat, then we might be really shifting the community structure and bringing in things that are out competing other species. There's some evidence that there's some competition between some of those very sort of bird seed oriented birds. But if there's a variety of things, and if we're not putting out so much of it that we grossly change the abundance of different things, then maybe the benefits of the connection to nature and our sort of interest in working on other things that support nature outweighs those potential impacts. So I think it ends up having to be something where if people think about what the consequences are, they've got to make their own choices about it.
Absolutely. And you can even think about it in terms of maybe you care a lot about the birds who happen to live in your backyard, regardless of the species. So it's an individualistic versus a population kind of thought. Like you want to help out those particular birds that are right there.
Yeah, I think there are some things that we can do to try to also make the food as healthy as possible, so that we're not contributing to disease loads. There's some evidence about conjunctivitis and diseases that are transmitted from bird to bird at feeders. So those things that induce really high densities and lots of interactions, kind of what we're thinking about right now with our own behavior and social isolation, and not having clean bird feeders and things like that. So there's some advice out there, and one of my colleagues, Kevin McGraw, is also working on food that, like, working with seed producers to try to get food that has good nutritional balance for birds.
That's a great point. A lot of people are rethinking what they're feeding their pets, for instance, and I guess wildlife is the next step. So this talking about these interactions and our interactions with nature is a great segue to the next vignette. I want to give that one enough time. So let's move on to that. Stepping back, we talked about why we're interested in conserving nature in cities. And a lot of people, even well-meaning ecologists, say, why not just put everyone into these huge mega dense cities and then leave nature alone out there and start rewilding a lot of the world, because cities are growing, especially with suburban sprawl, and we really need to protect these natural areas.
Yeah. Yeah. So one big chunk of my work was focused on Boston and thinking about different scenarios for the future of Boston, and what would be some of the different trade-offs that we would run into in terms of trying to, increase human population density, so that, as you said, we don't continue this sort of trend of just expanding outward and outward and consuming open land in the surrounding area. But here's, this quote I think exemplifies some of the potential costs to humans if we have a certain kind of density anyway in cities. So if you have very dense areas, and this is a quote from some focus groups that colleagues of mine and I did in Boston. If you don't have a lot of personal green space, so you have this green area, this park, it's more connected to nature, walking out to nature, more serenity, peacefulness instead of a concrete jungle. So this is harkening back to what I said at the beginning about there's many aspects of human well-being, mental health, physical health, that are tied to having access to green spaces in our immediate surrounding area. Having walkable streets and things like that, and walkable streets with trees. There's a study from New York that actually was able to parse out the effect of having not just walkable streets, but walkable streets with tree canopy, having a sort of an additional health benefit. So, so how do we square all these things together? And one of the solutions in working with landscape architects is I had gone into it thinking either things are dense and people have no green space, or they're too spread out and we're having a big impact on the land. But it doesn't have to be completely either or. There's some very creative landscape designers and builders who come up with ways to have dense high-rise living with green space around them. So that's one thing, is to sort of not try to think of it too much as an either or as much as possible. But then also, to recognize the importance of local green space to people's health and well-being. And there's many ways to achieve that. So green roofs and green walls are becoming sort of some of the other, new creative solutions that people are coming up with. They're not perfect. They're not, each of them has their trade-offs associated with them.
And I have visited cities locally and all over that have some amazing examples of green spaces, and really nice. Central Park comes to mind as this amazing, massive park in the middle of the most densely populated city in the United States. But we know that these these green spaces are not spread out evenly in the cities. So my next question is, how do the legacies and histories of cities influence who has had access to green spaces and who has access now?
All right, let's talk about this word access first. So I have a couple of images to help us think about, like, what does access look like? So you can, part of access is just, is there any green space at all in your neighborhood or not? But another part is, what kind of green space is it? And so on the left, we have a little park that was actually, had been a vacant lot that was then redeveloped with the help of a local community greening organization that called the City Roots program. And you see the signage and the walkway and the fencing, all of these things that make it be sort of recognized as a place that people are welcome to go. As compared to this image on the right, which is actually from a green space, I think it's from the Abbey Brook area in Springfield. And so think about, would you really want to go, like, if you were sort of going, I wonder where I could go for a walk today. It's like, which one of these two pictures would you pick, right? And while the one on the right, for many of us who are biologists, are like, well, there's sort of like probably some interesting things going on there. On the other hand, you still might think twice about, well, am I supposed to go there? There's no signage. That trail looks a little overgrown. What's going on in there? Is that a safe place for me to go? So there's aspects of safety and of feeling welcomed, and that are affected by the design and the sort of caretaking and the stewardship of green spaces. So having signage, paths, cues to care is one of these phrases that landscape architects use. It gives us signs that this is a place that it's okay for me to be. And the more you increase access, there's some potential costs of human impacts on the wildlife there, but it also increases vigilance, so the capacity for people to monitor what's going on there and avoid things like crime happening. It facilitates people's attachment, and so therefore their sort of interest and willingness to help take care of that place, and so facilitates stewardship. So that's one of the things we've been looking at, is these potential feedback loops, that if you actually create access, more access for more people, that it can have positive feedbacks into caretaking of spaces. But another aspect of feeling welcome in a space is conditioned not just by the physical characteristics of the space, but by social norms and by the sort of the interactions of people with one another in and around those spaces. So so it shapes the perceptions of whether people feel like they would be welcome and that they would belong in a space. So I highlight here the Black Birders Week as a really powerful example, recent example of where we've had to grapple with. It's become, you know, sort of brought front and center that that not everyone feels welcome because of who they're perceived to be. So this incident in Central Park where a white woman called the police on a Black birder who merely asked her to leash her dog kind of threw a spotlight on this, about how our identities and how our identities are perceived by others conditions our ability to enjoy natural areas, not just in cities, but everywhere. So this is a broader question of access. And, you know, so race is one aspect of that identity, sexual orientation, perceived sexual identity. Those are other aspects. And then when you have intersections between those, then that creates other things to think about as well. So I wanted to talk about all those different aspects of access. A big part of my work has been focusing on the distribution, sort of where is green space and who gets to have access to green space. But just by knowing where it is doesn't necessarily tell us the whole story. I wanted to emphasize.
That is a great point. And it's definitely front and center in our minds as urban ecologists right now, with the Black Lives Matter movement going on in this country, and seeing all the ways that there are disparities between different groups of people, whether it be health disparities or even in the case of the Black Birders Week and the awareness surrounding that, access to natural resources.
So
Yeah,
are there questions there that I should address, or I can also illuminate a little bit of the work we've done in Phoenix on this?
yeah, I think we should talk about that a little bit.
All right, so I want you to sort of take a look at this park. This is a park in Phoenix, and again, sort of picture yourself walking through this park and thinking about what you might see there, what sort of species you might see. You see there's these flowering Palo Verde trees that are a wonderful native tree species of the Sonoran Desert in the area around Phoenix. There's shrubbery, there's, you know, a nice walkway. And then compare that to this space, which has a lot more pavement, very little trees or shrubbery. It has palm trees, and a lot of grass. And so my early work in, like, the first place that I started doing research on the ecology of cities was in Phoenix at these two parks, amongst others. And it was a very striking sort of eye-opening experience for me to see how different the parks were that people had access to in different parts of the city. And we very quickly were able to see from looking at US Census data how that aligned with socioeconomic characteristics of the neighborhood. So wealthier portions of the city had much more diverse parks and especially much more diverse just streetscapes in general. So the yards and all of the sort of plantings in a whole neighborhood were much more diverse in wealthier neighborhoods, predominantly white neighborhoods in Phoenix, and the lower income, predominantly Latino or Latinx neighborhoods were places like where this park here exists. So what went with that was also the kinds of creatures that people were able to see in their day-to-day lives. So we use this axis of socioeconomic status, which is sort of comprises a whole lot of different, social scientists use it as a way to look at, they talk about how social class and social status, sort of people tend to group within cities, that there's spatial segregation. And that spatial segregation has been enforced by policies and by norms over over decades. And so the patterns of distribution of where people live are shaped partly by individual choice, but very strongly conditioned by policies and mortgage lending practices and other institutional factors. And the consequences are then that in lower income, predominantly, as I said, Hispanic, Latino, Latinx neighborhoods in Phoenix, people can see starlings and they can see some broadly distributed generalist species, like common species like the great-tailed grackle. But if you want to see birds that are unique to the Sonoran Desert, you mostly have to live in a predominantly white, predominantly wealthy neighborhood in Phoenix, where you have this curve-billed thrasher, Say's phoebe, and other really cool Sonoran Desert birds that do occur in those neighborhoods. But there's a very striking gradient there.
Wow, that is striking. Just thinking about a lot of people don't stop to think about what animals they experience on a day-to-day basis, and if that could differ by socioeconomic status. It's something that really brings to light how we've structured our cities, or either intentionally or unintentionally.
Yeah. And we've gone on to look at this at cities around the world and compile a set of studies from around the world. And this is a very common pattern, but it's not the only pattern. And so, again, there's a great many ways that cities can have policies that even things out, especially in public green spaces. So the parks are actually less different, even though I showed you two really stark examples for Phoenix. The parks are less different across along a sort of axis of socioeconomic status or wealth than the yards and neighborhoods. And so investments from municipalities can make a difference and can even things out. And there's also sort of community empowerment is another mechanism. So there are places where there's the social capital, the sort of interaction between neighbors who can work together to advocate for improvements to neighborhoods. So there's a lot of mechanisms that can counteract these challenges.
Right. So we just have a couple minutes left. I want to leave a little bit of time for questions. We might go over slightly, but can you speak a little bit more about how we facilitate empowering communities in those decision-making factors about green spaces?
Yeah. So I use the word partnerships and empowerment. So this is so some of the work that I've done in sort of looking at urban greening in Boston, for example, like the having organizations that can partner with neighborhood groups to help provide resources that neighborhoods may not have, but to achieve what the neighborhood wants to achieve in it. So, so the pictures on the right are from the City Roots program projects that they did in Boston, where City Roots would provide the plant material and guidance on where to get it and what sort of different things might grow well here. But the neighbors were the ones that decided, okay, this is a place that we want to do a project. This is a place where we want to plant some trees, or we want to have a community garden, or we want to have a little park bench in place for people to rest. What kind of green space was determined by the people that lived there, so that they could achieve what they wanted to achieve from it. The one on the left is a picture from a partnership between, there's a, shoot, I'm going to forget the name of the institute. It's associated with Yale University, but it's a nonprofit that works on community greening efforts. I'll think about it in a minute. They partnered with Connecticut Audubon, and the purpose of that greening organization is so they work again with residents that ask for something. Like a resident said, in this area, this was this derelict end of a street. There was no place for kids to play. It was this tangled vegetation, overgrown with vines and things like that. And so the neighbor said, we need a place for kids to play. And Connecticut Audubon said, well, we'd also like to enhance bird habitat and provide more native plantings. So then the go-between was the greening organization that had strong relationships with the community, had trust within the community, and then worked with Connecticut Audubon to say, okay, here's what they're looking for. And the Connecticut Audubon say, well, can we add a native planting area around the playground? And so then they worked together to come up with something that both enhanced habitat and enhanced and beautified the neighborhood in ways that the neighbors wanted. And I think it's really important that we don't just impose from outside on neighbors. Let's have a great big, tree planting program, and some of those things have backfired when there's not strong trust in the neighborhood that this is actually something that people want.
That's a great example, and almost right in our backyard of people really building that trust in community groups and building up those areas to be how they envision it and making it nice for wildlife. So I think let's move on to a couple questions. Does that work for you, Paige? Okay.
Absolutely.
Our first question is, how can we reduce planting trees for car shade, which I think is a funny sort of thing, and increase food producing perennials like fruit and nut trees? How do we create green spaces for nature, diverse insects, animals, plants, not just what designers think works for people based on available funds?
Right. Well, I think that gets to what I was talking about, is that there really isn't a one size fits all for like a tree planting program or a greening program. That the context, both the physical context and the social context matters quite a bit as to what is going to work best. And so, there are some places where food producing plants work really well, and there's other places where it really doesn't, where dropping nuts and seeds and things are going to actually create problems, and it's not always easy to figure out. There's not always a consensus in any one place as to what people want. So I'm not sure I'm answering the question all that well, but I think there are some of these sustainable sites initiatives and programs that are oriented towards trying to figure out, like, what, given that you want to do some kind of planting project, what are some of your options that are going to work here in these places? What's a palette of things that you could choose from that are beautiful or produce food or produce shade, things like that?
It's a great point. It's never as simple as you would think. If anyone has ever been to a town council meeting or city council meeting, they know that there's always opposition to anything, basically. So it's a give and take. So my last question for you before we wrap up is, what does the future look like under this increase in urbanization and biodiversity? And is there a positive sort of bent to this?
Yeah, that's been a great question. Yeah, what does the future look like? Yeah, I guess there are probably several different futures that we could find ourselves moving towards, and it sort of depends on choices that people make. And one of the things that is a cause for optimism for me is just how many different places that I've worked and visited, that there are these sort of strong grassroots organizations that are focused on greening efforts, and very often these greening efforts are not specifically, some of them are specifically tied to biodiversity, but they, so, when there can be an alignment, a sort of like synergistic alignment between, organizations that are focused on biodiversity or particular species, like, the Audubon Society, the different Audubons, when those can be aligned with other things that people want to have happen, then that can work out to be a really great win-win. And there's a great deal of push towards using green solutions to things like climate change mitigation and adaptation. There's definitely big things to figure out in terms of the sort of justice aspects of those, and making sure that cities are not just imposing climate change at green solutions in places that are harmful to communities, or not even investing in some communities and only in others. But cities are the leaders right now in thinking about how to have policy choices that adjust to climate change much more than at the national level. So that's one of my causes for optimism, is that there are a lot of municipal leaders and grassroots organizations that are working to try to make cities both more livable and more sustainable. And I think that a corollary effect will be greater support for biodiversity.
That is a positive outlook, and I'm also
I'm always an optimist.
Yeah. Right, exactly. But I am encouraged by the leadership that a lot of cities around the world really are taking in this. So with that, we're just about out of time. I apologize that we didn't get to go a little bit more in depth in some areas, but these discussions always, get really interesting and cover a whole lot of ground. So I would like to thank again Dr. Paige Warren for joining us and really opening our eyes into cities and nature in cities. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the great questions, everyone.
Yeah, and we will return in the fall, Science Cafe. And so stay tuned for that and check out our website and our Facebook and our Twitter and see how those will be. Obviously, not a lot of us can look as far ahead to the fall and know exactly how it will be. We'll be most likely continuing this webinar format. So thank you very much for joining us and have a great summer, everyone.
Bye, thank you.